Good morning. Welcome to Light of Life Mennonite Church. So glad you could join us again online this week. We are really seriously thinking about having services next week. It's not quite official yet, but we may be meeting in person next week. I have texts, numbers, phone numbers, email addresses for most people that I'm familiar with. If you would like specific information between now and next week to confirm that we are meeting in person next week, you may feel free to get a hold of me. I would be glad to make sure you get that information. People who routinely get my emails or text messages, I will be contacting you to let you know what's happening next week. When we do meet in person, what we're planning to do is record our service, at least portions of it. There's some parts that we will not record, but the message and the call to worship and a few things like that, the verse of the month and that sort of thing. And so we'll record that and then we'll post it in the afternoon. So it'll be available Sunday afternoon to watch online for those who are not comfortable coming and meeting with us in person. But that's kind of our plan. We'll see how it works out in the next week. A few things to confirm yet before we make that official. So stay tuned. I'm looking forward to seeing people actually sitting in these seats. We've got the sanctuary here arranged in such a way that families can sit together in groups of 3 or 4 or 5, however big the family is. And each family group will be social distanced from the other family groups by the recommended 6 feet. And inside the building, we're going to ask people to wear masks as they make their way to their seat. Once they're in their seat, they may feel free to take their mask off because we'll be following the social distancing guidelines. But we are working on this, and we really would like to be able to get back together. So enough about next week. Let's talk about this week. This week, we are going to be continuing our look at 1 Timothy, and we're going to be looking at this verse 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8, where it says, "We know that the law is good if one uses it properly." And that's an interesting verse, and it's maybe in some ways confusing. I mean, it seems very straightforward. The law is good if it's used properly. That applies to so many things. But when we start talking about the law, and Paul here obviously is referring to the Old Testament law of Moses and the Pentateuch. Basically, the Old Testament is what the Jewish people saw of as the law. It's good if it's used properly. What's this coming from? Where's this coming from? Well, remember, early in the book of 1 Timothy, in verse 3, Paul had commanded Timothy, who was basically overseeing the church in Ephesus, he said, command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer. And we talked about that. We haven't really gotten into exactly what that means. What are the false doctrines that he was supposed to command them not to preach or to teach? And it seems from the context what Paul is referring to there is teaching the law, obedience to the Old Testament law. And that's confirmed in verse 7 where it says, they want to be teachers of the law, but they do not know what they're talking about. So here Paul begins to talk about the law and says, the law is a good thing, but we have to understand its purpose. And so we want to talk about that a little bit today. Laws. What is the place of laws in our life? And in a very general sense, we know that laws are important. For example, we get to this intersection and we see that stop sign there. What does that stop sign mean? It means we're supposed to stop and check for traffic both ways. Look right, look left, and when it's safe to do so, proceed. We understand that. That's a law of our land. That's something that we do. We abide by that. Now, some of us, we do the rolling stop thing, but we know that the purpose is to check for cars and make sure it's safe before we go. I'm not endorsing rolling stops. Yes, we're supposed to come to a complete stop. That's the law. How about we get to an intersection like this? There is no stop sign there. Does that mean we can just blow through it? If you came to this intersection, would you blow through that intersection? How about if we broadened the view just a little bit? Would you blow through that intersection now? Well, you really can't see what's coming around the corner of that building. Laws are important because even in the absence of a stop sign, the law is that when you come to an intersection, if it's unmarked, you yield to other traffic. And so there's laws that control those things. Laws are important. Laws in our general life, every day, laws are important. And we need to have an understanding of the laws that control us. Why are laws so important? Well, laws are important because people tend to have a wicked side. We as human beings have wickedness inside of us. And to varying degrees, that wickedness comes out in the things that we do. And as a result of that wickedness that dwells inside of all of humanity, we see lawbreakers, such as vandalism or robbery, maybe assaults or rape or even murder. These things are against the law. And the reason they're against the law is they are contrary to human society's success. We want to be able to live together in security and safety. And therefore, laws are put in place because people have a wicked side. We need laws to guide us and to direct us and to provide a mechanism to apprehend and punish or correct people who are living contrary to social norms. Yeah. There was a sociological study that was done. It was some time ago, and so I won't validate it. I don't know if it's still valid, but this was what was discovered in this study that was conducted some years back. It said the cause of crime cannot be traced to environment, poverty, or oppression. A lot of times people try to blame things on something else. And this study was conducted to see if there was some connection between environment, poverty, or oppression that led to a life in crime, and they couldn't find one. The Bible kind of points us toward criminal behaviors, or the reason for criminal behaviors, I should say. In Jeremiah chapter 17, where it says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. It's inside of us. In our heart is this tendency to be wicked, to break the law, to do things that are contrary to productive society. So laws are important. But, some laws are kind of silly too. There are some laws that, just don't make any sense at all. For example, in California, there is a law, and again, this is a little bit old information, so I don't know if it's still valid, but at some time, a few years back, there was a law that said, if a frog dies during a frog jumping contest, you can't eat it. That frog cannot be eaten if it dies during a frog. Now, that just seems like a silly law. Why would we need a law like that? That seems... Well, it's not just in California. Florida has one too. It says dwarf tossing is not allowed. In Florida, it's against the law to toss dwarves. And you could go down the list. Every state has their silly little laws. Some laws are silly. While laws are important, some are silly. And you know what? Even we Christians are not exempt. If we go to the Bible, we can find some references in the law that seem to us to be silly. And people who don't believe the Bible are very quick to point these out. For example, Deuteronomy 22 verse 9 says, do not plant two kinds of seed in your vineyard. What does it matter? What's the big deal? Or in Leviticus 19:19, do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. I think we've all disobeyed that one. Leviticus 19:27, do not cut the hair on the sides of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. In other words, I disobeyed the law this morning. Laws are important, but some seem silly, and Christians aren't exempt. So, what do we do with the law? And when I say the law, I'm talking about the Mosaic law, the law in the Bible, the law that Paul was talking about when he said to Timothy, the law is good when it's used properly. We have a tendency as Christians to kind of hunt and peck through the law and say, you know what, this one makes sense. I'm going to obey that one, and I'm going to force everybody else to obey it too. But that one over there, you know what, it's really not too significant. What do we do with the law? We as believers need to, in our own mind, have an understanding of the purpose of the law. And that's what Paul was talking about. The law is good as long as it's used for the right purpose, as long as it's used properly. And Jesus talked about the law. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I'm not to come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. He went on to say, for truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter or the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Jesus standing behind the law of the Old Testament, saying the law is important. It's got its place. So what do we as believers do with the law? It was a continuing problem. After Jesus' death and resurrection and his ascension into heaven and his charge to the church to, go out and minister to the entire world, to preach the gospel to all nations, that early church started struggling with, what do we do with the law? Where do we fit it into this concept of Christian life and salvation through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ? It was an important question in Acts chapter 15. There in Acts chapter 15, this is Paul, the same Paul who wrote the letter to Timothy, the same Paul who's gone down and been missionary in many different places. But they're in a particular situation, in a particular place. And it says there in Acts chapter 15, certain people came down from Judea to Antioch. Antioch is where Paul was performing his ministry. He was kind of like a pastor there. And believers came down from Judea. That's up where Jerusalem was. You might think of that as the capital at that point. They came down and they were teaching the believers that unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. And what they were doing there was saying, you know what, God, it's the same God who is God of the Jews as who we Christians embrace. It's the same God. Jewish people and Christians worship the same God. And this God never changes. The Old Testament makes it very clear that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so their reasoning was God commanded us to perform this rite of circumcision. So as believers, as Christians, we need to continue to follow that. This idea of circumcision is used here just as an example of one of the many laws. And I don't want to limit it to that, but it's an example from Acts chapter 15. And it comes from Genesis chapter 17, where God makes his original covenant with Abraham. And in that context, God says to Abram, this is my covenant with you and your descendants. He goes on to say, every male among you shall be circumcised. And then he concludes that statement by saying, my covenant is in your flesh, is to be an everlasting covenant. What does everlasting mean? Well, that means forever and ever. So God, when he talked to Abraham way back there in Genesis chapter 17, says, forever and ever, I want you to be known as a people who are circumcised. And that's a tangible way that we can identify one another. So the early church was struggling with that. Some of the believers from Jerusalem were teaching that, okay, you guys, if you Gentiles want to become Christians, that's fine. Christ has opened the door. You're welcome to become Christians. But before you can be a Christian, you need to become a Jew, and you need to embrace the Jewish traditions, and you need to be circumcised, and you need to follow all the other aspects of the law. The law. What do we do with the law? They were struggling with that, and it's something we still struggle with today. Well, in that time, in Acts chapter 15, we hear from the story in the next verse, it says, Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to go up to Jerusalem and see the apostles and elders about the question. And you can read the story there, how they went up and they had this discussion. They had a meeting. It's called the Jerusalem Council. And they talked about, what do we do with the law? And they resolved that issue for that time. But we're still faced with the question, what do we do with the law? And so here in today's text, Paul underscores the importance of the law. He says, we know that the law is good if one uses it properly. So let's talk about the purpose of the law. In order to use it properly, we need to know what its purpose is. So I just wanted to outline a few things. Now, I don't intend for this to be a conclusive list, but it's a few things I think that are important that we understand about the law. And when I say the law, I am referring basically to the Old Testament. There's aspects of the law. There's parts of the Old Testament that are history, and there's parts that are other things. But in general, the Old Testament is the Mosaic law and those things that go along with it. So that's what we're talking about here. What do we do with it? Well, the first thing is one thing that we cannot do with the law. You cannot be saved by obeying the law. The Bible makes that abundantly clear. It is very clear in the New Testament. The New Testament makes it obvious that you cannot be saved by obeying the law. But even in the Old Testament, you can see hinting at this because it's such an important understanding. Just a couple verses to support that. Romans chapter 3. This is verse 20. Again, Paul writing. He says, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. In other words, obeying the law will not make you righteous in God's sight. That's not what God is looking for. God is looking for something beyond that. Another one from Galatians chapter 3. Clearly, no one who relies on the law is justified before God. You cannot be saved by obeying the law. One more from Ephesians chapter 2. For it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. This is such an important verse because it gives us the other side of that coin. You cannot be saved by obeying the law, but there is salvation available. It is by grace that you're saved through faith. And he goes on to say, and this is not of yourselves, it is a gift of God, not by works. In other words, we can't earn it. We can only receive it. And that is such an important principle for us as believers to understand. We cannot, by obeying the law, earn our salvation. This has been preached for years and years and years by many, many Christian theologians. But there's still a lot of confusion around this in the church today. You cannot be saved by obeying the law. It is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not of yourselves. It's a gift of God. It's not by works. So that's one thing that the law, the purpose of the law, that is not. It's not a purpose of the law to bring us salvation. So what is the purpose of the law? Well, a couple things that I want to highlight this morning. First of all, the law shows us the holy character of God. You know, the Bible tells us right back in the very early chapters that we are created in the image of God. In other words, there's something about us that is like God. We're not God, and we're not going to become gods in some future life. But there's something about us that's like God because we are created in the image of God. And so when God gives the law in the Old Testament through Moses, and he explains to the people back then and to us through his word today how we should live, he's explaining to us how we can be like him. We're encouraged to be like God. In Leviticus 19 it says, "Be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy." God calls us to be like him. And he calls us to do that through the law, which in turn shows us the holy character of God. God is a holy God. He is perfect in every way. There is nothing about God that could possibly be improved upon. He is perfect in every way, and he calls us to be holy because he is holy. And he does that through the law. He says this is an indication, a human way of looking at what I'm like. And I'm challenging you, I'm inviting you to imitate me, to be like me. Be holy because I am holy. So the law shows us a bit about the holy character of God. So that's one thing, the purpose of the law, one thing that the law is good for. We know that the law is good if one uses it properly. If we use the law to learn about the character, the holy character of God, that's a good use of the law. Another one, I think, is gives us guidance for holy living. It helps us, as we learn about what God is like, to be more like God. Again, we will never become gods, but God invites us to be like him, to imitate him. And there is a wonderful, wonderful book or chapter in the Bible, Psalms 119, that talks all about God's law and the blessing that it is to people. And that chapter starts off in verse 1 with, "Blessed are those whose ways are blameless, who walk according to the law of the Lord." That word blessed is one that we many times don't understand because it's not one that we use very frequently except in church circles. But it means to have those things that bring us contentment and joy. We're blessed. Who's blessed? Blessed are those whose ways are blameless, who walk according to the law of the Lord. God's law, one of the purposes of God's law, is to give us guidance for holy living so that we can experience these blessings. Another verse from that same chapter, in verse 105, it says, "Your word is a lamp for my feet, a light for my path." God's word, God's law, gives us guidance for holy living. And that's an important purpose of the law. The law shows us the holy character of God, and it gives us guidance for holy living. One more thing I want to include in this list. Again, I want to emphasize that I don't claim that this list is exhaustive. I would invite you to send me an email or a text. What are some other things that could be added to this list? But I want to add one more before we go because I think it's the most important of them all. It shows us our need for Christ. The law shows us our need for Christ. The law shows us the holy character of God, and it gives us guidance for holy living. But if we're honest with ourselves, we very quickly acknowledge that we fail to live up to that challenge. We do not meet the expectations of the law. We do not live our lives as imitators of God. In fact, many times we fail. So the law, part of the purpose of the law, is to show us our need for Christ. Romans chapter 3 tells us, through the law, we became conscious of our sin. In other words, we understood what it was. We understood that, yes, this thing is contrary to God's character, therefore I should avoid it. That picture I showed you earlier of the T intersection without a stop sign, that had that building right there in the corner where you couldn't possibly see around it. You would know enough to not just blow through that intersection. You could get smacked in the side pretty hard, and it would be serious. The stop sign is there to remind you that, it would be a good idea to stop here because somebody could be coming. And that's the purpose of our laws, to remind us, to point us in the right direction. But because many times we do those rolling stops and other things like it, we are reminded of our need for forgiveness. It shows us our need for Christ. Through the law, we became conscious of our sin, our separation from God. Romans chapter 7, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. In other words, Paul's saying here, it is because of the law that I'm aware of my sinfulness, the deceitfulness within me, my need for forgiveness. And that's part of the purpose of the law. So that's just a little touch on what we do with the law. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, Paul is addressing that with Timothy because Timothy is responsible for this young church, growing up in an age when a lot of things weren't real clear yet. They were still trying to figure it out. And they were wrestling with this question, what do we do with the law? The law was so precious to the Jewish Christians, because they grew up understanding that they were part of the Jewish nation and God had given them this special responsibility, this special blessing of the law. And now that they had received Christ as their Savior, it was a normal question, a natural question to say, okay, what do we do with that? What do we do with the law? This week, I encourage you to think about, what do you do with the law? The purpose of the law. The law is good. The law is good if we use it properly. And so that's my challenge. The law shows us the holy character of God. The law gives us guidance for holy living. The law shows us our need for Christ, for forgiveness. And that forgiveness that only comes through Jesus Christ. But following the law cannot and will not ever save anyone. And it's really important that we as believers know that. It's an area where we fail. We fall down. And we still need to wrestle with this question. What do we do with the law? I pray that you will think about that this week, and that you will allow the Holy Spirit to speak to you through His Word as you dig in and try to understand the right place for the law in your life. God bless you all. I hope you have a great week.